People ask me how it started. I tell them it started with a box. They usually laugh at that. I don't correct them, because the laugh is a comfortable thing, and comfortable things are in short supply out on Kethmar, and I've learned not to waste them. But the honest answer is that it didn't start with the box at all. The box was just when I stopped being a man who wasn't paying attention and became something else. What that something else is, I'm still working out. My daughter tells me I'm a father. My wife tells me I'm stubborn. The Vithani Compliance Directorate's file on me, last I heard, runs to 47 pages. I expect all 3 of them are right. Let me go back to the beginning, or close enough to it. Orel's Crossing is not a place people choose. That's an important thing to understand about the settlement, because it explains almost everything else. The 42 families who live inside the perimeter wire didn't sit down with a map of the inhabited worlds and say yes. That thin-aired dusty plateau, 200 kilometers from anywhere on the 3rd most marginal agricultural colony in the Kethmar system. That's where we want to spend our lives. We ended up there, the way sediment ends up at the bottom of a river. The Federation's resettlement compact shuffles people who have nowhere else to go to places that need filling. And Orel's Crossing needed filling. And so, here we are. I got the posting because I'm an administrator. A good one. Actually, I don't say that for pride. I say it because it's relevant. I know how forms work. I know how filings work. I know which lever moves which gear in the Federation's bureaucratic machinery. And I know how long it takes for a decision made in a central office 7 light minutes away to filter down to a settlement administrator on a dusty plateau who is just trying to keep 42 families fed through a growing season that lasts 119 days if everything goes right, and 62 if it doesn't. I came to Kethmar 8 years ago with a posting, a shipping container of personal effects, and a conviction that competent administration was a form of service that didn't require any particular kind of life on the side. I was 41. I am 53 now. I know considerably more than I did then. The Resettlement Compact's domestic partnership provision is not romantic. I want to be clear about that, because there are people who come to this story expecting something sentimental, and I don't have anything sentimental to give them. The compact exists because the Federation's xenosociological modeling suggests that mixed-species domestic units produce more stable settlement outcomes than single-species clusters on marginal colonies. It exists because there are populations of displaced persons across the Federation who need placement, and settlements like mine that need personnel. It is a practical arrangement between parties with compatible needs, overseen by the Bureau of Cross-Species Resettlement, and it runs on the same logic as any other administrative process. Consent, documentation, periodic review. I applied for a compact partner in my 5th year on Kethmar. Not because I was lonely, or not only because of that. The settlement needed a second administrator. The Bureau would fund a resettlement placement, but not a straight hire. A compact partner qualified for placement. It was, like most things in my life, a solution that solved 2 problems at once. The Bureau sent me a file. Name, Seti Vaz of the Velhari Dispersal Group, currently in transit processing at Kethport. Species, Velhari. I'd heard of them, roughly. The way you hear of most things in a Federation file. Displaced about 3 decades back, when the Vithani Compliance Directorate reclassified their home settlements as provisional, non-sovereign territory. Age, 38, standard years. Prior occupation, agricultural records, which was why the Bureau matched her to me. Education, Federation, secondary certification, plus 2 years of extended study, interrupted by displacement. No noted dependents. That last entry would turn out to be wrong, but the Bureau didn't know that, and at the time, neither did I. I met her at the transit depot in Kethport, which is a 4-hour drive from Orel's Crossing over roads that are generous with that designation. She was standing beside her luggage when I arrived, 2 soft bags, and an insulated transit crate about the size of a large storage trunk, sealed with a thermal lock. She was shorter than I'd expected from the file photo. Silver-green skin, the kind of pale that comes from years in transit stations and processing centers, rather than any natural shade. Dark hair, cut close. She held herself very still. We shook hands. Her fingers were cool and dry. She said, "Administrator Orell," and I said, "Just Devon, please." She considered this for a moment, then said, "Davin," as though she was filing it somewhere internally. I introduced myself properly and asked if she needed help with her things. She said the crate was environmental and she'd prefer to manage it herself. I said of course and loaded the bags in the back of the transport, and she lifted the crate herself with both hands and set it in beside her on the seat. The drive back was quiet. I pointed out the settlement perimeter as we came over the ridge, the scatter of prefab buildings, and the grain terraces stepping down the plateau's south face, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "It gets enough light." "For the crops, yes," I said. "Kethmar's day is 26 standard hours. Long growing window." She nodded. "The soil chemistry? We supplement. I'll show you the records." She nodded again, and that was most of the conversation for the rest of the drive. I didn't read it as hostility. I read it as someone who had been in transit too long, had talked to too many officials in too many processing centers, and had learned that silence was the safest mode of communication in uncertain circumstances. I understood that. I am, at my core, a cautious man. I find silence respectable. I'd set up the back bedroom for her and left the connecting door open so she could see the office, which ran along the building's east wall with a good morning light. She carried the crate to the back bedroom herself, set it in the corner, and came back to look at the office. She touched the edge of my desk. She looked at the filing system I'd built on the wall shelf, paper forms in one section, digital forms in another, compliance calendars on the third shelf, season-end reports on the fourth. "You keep duplicates," she said. "The satellite relay drops twice a week on average," I said. "Paper doesn't need a relay." She made a small sound that I later came to recognize as her version of a laugh. "I'll make a paper copy of everything," she said, and sat down at the second desk I'd placed by the window, and we went to work. That was how it started. We worked. That is a thing I want people to understand. The first months of Seti Vaz in my settlement were mostly administrative. She had good instincts for records and better instincts for seasonal timing. She caught 2 errors in my soil supplement documentation that would have cost us a late-season delivery within the first week. In the second week, she identified a recurring discrepancy in the water reclamation logs that turned out to be a sensor calibration issue I'd been misattributing to normal variance for 3 seasons. She redesigned my compliance calendar, so the Vathani inspection visit stopped landing in the middle of planting week. She built a cross-reference index for the Bureau's regional filing codes that I still use. She ate dinner at the table across from me and talked about the growing season, and occasionally about the Bureau's filing system, which she found, not unreasonably, labyrinthine. She had a dry way of describing administrative absurdity that I found I looked forward to. "The Federation's cross-species resettlement documentation," she observed one evening, "appeared to have been designed by a committee that had never resettled anyone, and maintained by a different committee that had never met the first." I said that was true of most Federation documentation, and she said, "Yes, but most Federation documentation didn't also require you to file your own existence in triplicate." I laughed. She made the small sound I would later learn was her version of the same thing. We kept working. She slept in the back bedroom with the door closed and the crate in the corner. She did not talk about herself much. She did not talk about the Velhari dispersal, or about the years in transit processing, or about whatever her life had been before it was interrupted. I did not ask. This is either a virtue of mine or a failing. I've been told both, but it comes from the same source, which is that I understand implicitly that people disclose what they're ready to disclose and not before, and that asking before someone is ready produces either pain or lies, and I have no use for either. She was careful about the crate. I noticed that without examining it too closely. She unlocked it with a code she never shared, and she did so in the back bedroom with the door shut. She did it every morning and every evening. At times, that became predictable enough that I simply didn't walk toward the back of the building during those windows. Twice in the first month, I heard sounds from behind the closed door, not alarming sounds, nothing sharp, just a low murmur of voice, too quiet to make out. I assumed she was speaking to someone on a personal comms device. I didn't ask. In the second month, she came to the kitchen table at dinner, looking exhausted, in a way that had a specific quality to it, the kind of tired that isn't about sleep. I put a plate in front of her and sat down, and she looked at the plate and then said, abruptly, "She's been restless." I said, because I didn't know yet what that meant, but I knew it was important. She said, "I'll need to find a better nutrient mix. The Velhari-compatible supplements in Kethport are expensive." "How much?" I said. She named a figure. I did the math against our quarterly supply budget, found the room, and said, "I'll add it to next month's order." Seti Vaz looked at me across the dinner table. Her amber eyes, all Velhari have amber eyes, I'd learned by then, a characteristic of the species, were steady and careful and reading something in my face. She said, "You haven't asked. I've been waiting for you to tell me." I said. Another long silence. She pushed a piece of flatbread around her plate. Then she said, "Her name is Omen. She's 4 standard years old. I've had her since she was 19 months. I nodded. "How is she doing?" Seti Vaz pressed her lips together. I learned later that this was her version of composing herself and said, "Better than I could have hoped. Worse than I'd want." "Is she sick?" She was. She isn't, right now. But Velhari children need open air and direct light. I've been managing without it. The crate has UV panels. A pause. "I know what you're thinking." "Tell me," I said. "That I misrepresented myself in the compact filing. That I listed no dependents when I had one. That you have grounds to report the discrepancy to the Bureau." I chewed on a piece of bread and thought about that for a moment. "That's one thing I'm thinking," I said. "The other thing I'm thinking is that the Bureau would have denied the compact filing if you declared a child." She looked at me sharply. "The compact's placement criteria for this colony classification requires dependents to be Federation-registered nationals," I said. "Velhari children born in the dispersal period are categorically listed as pending classification. That means they don't qualify as dependents under compact terms. The Bureau would have red-flagged the application and sent you somewhere else, or nowhere." I paused. "I used to work in transit allocation. Before Kethmar." Seti Vaz was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very carefully, "She doesn't have registration documents." "No," I said. "I wouldn't expect her to. The compliance inspection is in 6 weeks." "I know," I said. "If they find her." "I know," I said again. We sat at the dinner table for a while longer. The settlement makes a particular sound. At dusk, the wind comes off the northern ridge and catches the grain terraces and produces a low, papery rustling that I've always found calming. I listened to it. Then I said, "Can I meet her?" Seti Vaz looked at me for another long moment. Then she got up from the table and went to the back bedroom, and I heard her unlock the crate, and a minute later she came back to the kitchen. She was carrying a small person on her hip. The child was 4 years old, which is to say, very small Velhari children, I would learn, are close to human proportions, but with a longer juvenile period. So at 4 she was the size of a human 2-year-old, all over large amber eyes, and a round face, with the faint ridge marks along her cheekbones and jaw that are a Velhari characteristic. Her skin was the same silver green as Seti Vaz's, but brighter, less dulled by transit and fluorescent lighting. Her hair was dark and went in all directions. She looked at me with the absolute, undefended curiosity of a child who has been told that new things are possible. She said something in Velhari. I looked at Seti Vaz. "She's asking if you're the man who lives here." Seti Vaz said. "Yes," I said. "I am." The child Omen considered this information. Then she reached out and put her small hand flat on the kitchen table and looked at it, then at me, as though testing that the table was real. I put my own hand on the table a few inches from hers. She looked at both hands with great seriousness, then poked my knuckle once with one finger and pulled her hand back. "Hello," I said to her. She said something else in Velhari. Seti said, "She says your hand is big." "It is," I said. That was the first conversation I had with my daughter. The 6 weeks went faster than they should have. I spent the first 2 of them trying to find a registration pathway for Omen through the Bureau's standard channels. And I spent those 2 weeks learning what Seti had already spent 4 years learning, which is that there are no standard channels for a Velhari child born in the dispersal period on a settlement that the Vithani Compliance Directorate had reclassified as provisional, non-sovereign territory. The Velhari dispersal group is not stateless, in the way that word is usually used. They have a file, they have a designation, they have a pending classification review that has been pending for 28 years. But pending classification is not classification, and an unclassified child born to a pending status population is, in the Federation's administrative language, biologically present, legally indeterminate. Legally indeterminate persons are not eligible for most Bureau services. They are not eligible for standard resettlement placement. They are not eligible for educational registration. They are, in the specific language of the Vithani Compliance Directorate's interface with the Bureau, subject to status verification and remediation processing upon discovery. I looked up remediation processing. It took me 2 days of pulling threads through archived Bureau filings to find out what it actually meant, because the official documentation is written in the kind of passive voice administrative language that is specifically designed to communicate nothing while appearing to communicate everything. Terms like status normalization and non-conformant biological material management appear in the relevant sections, arranged in clean, sanitary prose that takes real effort to produce, because the truth underneath it is not clean and not sanitary. You have to follow each euphemism back to its definition, and each definition to its regulatory reference, and each regulatory reference to its implementation protocol. And by the end of that chain, you are reading mortality statistics in a quarterly facility report that was filed without comment in the Bureau's archival database 7 years ago, and apparently never read by anyone with the authority to do something about it. What remediation processing meant, stripped to the bone, was collection and institutional placement in a Vithani-administered processing facility, pending resolution of the pending classification review, which had been pending for 28 years. What it meant was that if the compliance officers found Omen in my settlement and ran her biometrics, she would be removed from Seti Vaz's care and transported to a facility whose conditions, based on the inspection records I found in the Bureau's own archived filings, were not compatible with a healthy childhood. There were mortality statistics. I read them. I don't need to repeat them here. I spent the 3rd and 4th week drafting a compact amendment filing. A compact amendment can be submitted by either party to a domestic compact to add a dependent to the agreement, subject to Bureau review. The review criteria require the dependent to hold Federation registration, which Omen didn't. But a compact amendment filing, once submitted, opens a formal review period during which the status of any persons named in the filing is considered under administrative review and therefore not subject to standard compliance processing, not exempt, not protected, under review. But under review meant the compliance officers would have to refer any action on Omen to the Bureau's Compact Review Division before they could initiate remediation processing, and the Compact Review Division had, per its own charter, a 60-day response window. 60 days was not a solution. 60 days was 60 days. I've spent most of my adult life understanding the difference, and right then, the difference was everything. I filed the amendment on day 41 of the 6 weeks. On day 43, I told Seti what I'd done. She sat across from me at the kitchen table. Alman was asleep in the back bedroom. She'd moved to a small cot next to the crate after the first week, because it turned out she slept better with the crate's UV panels cycling down at night than with nothing. Sci-Fi had stopped locking the bedroom door. "You filed a compact amendment," she said. "Yes." "Naming Alman as a dependent." "Yes." "Under your name." "Under both our names," I said. "The compact is mutual. The amendment filing has to be mutual too. I listed you as primary custodial party." She was very still. That places you in legal jeopardy if the Bureau determines the filing was made in bad faith." "I know. If they determine I misrepresented my status in the original compact application, they probably will determine that," I said. "I'm going to be honest about that with you. The amendment filing requires a disclosure of material omissions in the original compact registration. I disclosed the omission and gave the reasons for it. The Bureau doesn't have to accept that as sufficient." Sci-Fi looked at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface, the way Omen had put her hand flat on the table the first night, testing if things were real. "Why did you do this?" she said. "I thought about that. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because the answer was something I hadn't quite put into words yet, and I wanted to do it accurately. Because she's 4 years old," I said, "and she's sitting in a crate in my back bedroom, and the form that describes what happens to her, if the compliance officers find her, uses the word remediation, and I've been an administrator for long enough to know exactly what that word means when it's written in that font on that form." I paused. "And because I read the mortality statistics, and because she poked my knuckle and I had nothing on my schedule more important than making sure she can keep doing that." Sci-Fi was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "If this doesn't work, then we try the next thing," I said. "There are a lot of things to try before there are no things left. I've been doing Federation administration for 20 years, and I know where the levers are." She looked at me with those amber eyes, steady and careful and reading something, the same way she'd read my face over the dinner table that first night. Whatever she was reading, she must have found it convincing. She nodded once. Then she got up and went to the back bedroom and came back with Omin on her hip, the child drowsy and blinking, hair in every direction. Omin looked at me with sleepy amber eyes. She said something in Velhari. "She says the floor is cold," Sci-Fi said. "Come here," I said, and held out my arms, and after a moment's consideration, Omin transferred herself to them, all small warm weight, and settled her head against my shoulder with the absolute practical confidence of a child who has decided that a given surface is adequate for sleeping. We stood there in the kitchen of my prefab house, on the dusty plateau of Orel's Crossing, and I held my daughter for the first time, and Sci-Fi stood across from me watching with an expression I couldn't quite read, and the wind came off the northern ridge and rustled through the grain terraces outside. The compliance inspection arrived on schedule, as compliance inspections always do, because the Bethany Compliance Directorate runs on a very particular kind of institutional punctuality that never leaves room for uncertainty about when they are coming. What it leaves room for is uncertainty about what they'll find when they arrive. There were 4 of them. Lead Inspector Kavith's son was the sort of official who has been doing a job long enough to have perfected the precise blend of procedural authority and personal contempt that makes bureaucratic power feel like a natural feature of the landscape. He had the specific Vithani tallness. All the Vithani compliance officers are tall. I don't know if that's selection criteria or just how they breed, and the pale blue-gray coloring of the administrative caste, and a tablet that he carried at a precise angle, not quite horizontal, not quite vertical, a bureaucratic middle distance. His 3 assistants were younger and quieter. I met them at the settlement perimeter and walked them through the standard inspection. Grain storage, water reclamation, soil management, compliance calendar. I walked them through the administrative office, and they checked the filings. Kaveth Son noted the paper duplicates and gave me a look that managed to convey both professional approval and personal skepticism simultaneously. Then they moved to the residential buildings, which is the part of a standard compliance inspection I had spent 20 days preparing for. In a compact status residence, a compliance inspection covers three things: property inventory, occupancy verification, and dependent status confirmation for any persons listed in the compact registration. I had filed the compact amendment 33 days prior. The amendment was under bureau review. The amendment named Omen. This meant that when Kavith San opened his occupancy verification sequence and encountered a small Velhari child sitting on a cot in my back bedroom, he could not initiate remediation processing without a bureau referral authorization. He could, however, initiate a status inquiry, which he did. He stood in the doorway of the back bedroom and looked at Omen, who was sitting on her cot with her legs folded under her, looking at him with the flat, unsentimental attention of a child who has encountered authority figures before and has a working theory about them. She was wearing a tunic that Seti Voss had made from settlement fabric, pale gray, with a small embroidered line along the collar that I had watched Seti Voss work on in the evenings over the preceding week, moving the needle with the focused patience she brought to everything. She looked small and very still, and she did not look frightened, because in 4 years of hiding in a crate, Seti Voss had apparently done the remarkable thing of raising a child who was wary without being broken. Wary was a skill. Broken was something else. You learn the difference when you read the right filings. Kavith San turned to me. "There is a juvenile Velhari present in this residence," he said. "Yes," I said. "The Velhari juvenile does not hold Federation registration." "No," I said. "She does not. She is named as a dependent under amendment filing case number BCRA 7741, Keth M. Currently under bureau review. The amendment was submitted 33 days ago and is within the 60-day review window. Per compact amendment processing protocol, her status is administratively indeterminate, pending bureau determination." He looked at me. The look had the quality of a man recalibrating. He had walked into this inspection expecting, I suspect, to find either a clean settlement or a violation straightforward enough to process on site. He had not walked in expecting a filing number. "You are claiming pendant compact status for the juvenile," he said. "I'm not claiming anything," I said. "I'm informing you of an existing filing. The filing number is in your system. You can query it right now if you'd like." He queried it. I watched him read the filing summary on his tablet. I watched his expression remain professionally neutral in the way that professionally neutral expressions tend to when they're covering something else. "The amendment filing discloses a material omission in the original compact registration," he said. "It does," I said. "You are aware that a material omission in a compact registration constitutes grounds for compact review and potential nullification." "I am," I said. "If the Bureau nullifies the compact, that's a separate proceeding with its own timeline and review criteria. It doesn't affect the status of the amendment filing as it currently stands, which names Omen as a dependent under this residence's compact." He looked at me again. Then he looked past me at Seti Voss, who was standing very still in the kitchen doorway, and then past her at Omen on the cot. Omen was watching him with her amber eyes. She had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, picked up the small carved wooden figure, roughly egg-shaped, which I'd made badly from a piece of settlement timber that she'd started carrying everywhere, and she was holding it in both hands with a seriousness that seemed disproportionate to the object's simplicity. "I will need to file a non-conformance report," Kavith San said. "Of course," I said. "I'll provide you the complete amendment documentation for attachment." He filed his non-conformance report. He attached my documentation. He did not initiate remediation processing, because he couldn't, because I had given him a 60-day window I intended to make last considerably longer than 60 days. They left at mid-afternoon. The settlement went quiet. Seti Voss stood at the kitchen window and watched the compliance transport disappear over the ridge. Then she turned around and said, "You gave him a filing number." "I gave him the correct filing number for an amendment I filed 33 days ago," I said. She looked at me. You knew exactly what he was going to say. I've been doing this a long time, I said. She looked at me for another long moment. I was at the desk by then, already drafting the response to the expected bureau follow-up inquiry. Omen had migrated from her cot to the kitchen and was standing behind Seti Voss, holding the wooden figure, watching me with great attention. Davin, Seti Voss said. Yes. What happens at 60 days? We file a status extension request, citing an unresolved procedural irregularity in the original amendment documentation, I said. That opens another 30-day window. While that window is open, we file a parallel application under the Kethmar Settlement Expansion provision, which allows unregistered persons physically present in a qualifying settlement for more than 90 consecutive days to be considered for provisional settlement residency. I paused. We need to get to 90 days. She was quiet for a moment. How many days has she been here? 44, I said. As of today. Seti Voss closed her eyes. Just for a second. And the settlement expansion provision, does it actually cover Velhari dispersal status children? The provision language says persons, I said. It doesn't specify species or registration status. It's never been tested against a Velhari dispersal status child because nobody's tried. Because it would require someone to file the application and then spend however long it takes arguing with the Vethany Compliance Directorate and the Bureau's Kethmar Regional Office about whether persons means persons. I looked up at her. I'm an extremely good arguer when it comes to the meaning of administrative language. I've been arguing with the Bureau's Kethmar office about seasonal supply classifications for 6 years, and I've won 8 of 12 disputes. I paused. I'm going to win this one too. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The evening light was coming in from the west and catching the dust that always hangs in Kethmar's lower atmosphere, turning it amber, and through the window, the grain terraces looked almost warm. Then she sat down at her desk, opened the filing interface, and said, "Tell me how I can help. I won't walk you through every step of the next 6 months, because most of it was paper. A lot of paper. More paper than I'd generated in any 6-month period of my professional life, which is saying something, because I am a man who generates paper the way the Northern Ridge generates wind, consistently, reliably, with a force that comes from geography and can't be argued with. The Bureau's Compact Review Division came back in 49 days, which was faster than I'd expected. They found the compact filing technically valid. My disclosure of the original omission had been complete and accurate, which is harder to penalize than an undisclosed omission, and they placed the compact amendment under extended review rather than rejecting it. Extended review meant I kept my 60-day window. I filed the status extension request. The status extension request opened a new 30-day window. Day 89, by my count, I filed the settlement expansion provision application. I named Amen, gave her complete biometric records. I'd done a Federation format biometric scan myself, using the settlement's standard agricultural survey equipment, in a way the equipment's manufacturer had not intended, but the software did not prohibit, and attached the full compliance inspection record, including Kaveth San's non-conformance report, which was useful evidence that Omen had been physically present in the settlement at the time of a compliance-verified inspection. The Vethany Compliance Directorate contested the expansion provision application on 12 separate grounds. I replied to each of the 12 grounds with specific citations from the provision's enabling legislation, the Bureau's own implementation guidance, and 3 precedent cases from other Keth system settlements that had used the provision for non-registered persons, none of which involved Velhari dispersal status children, but all of which established that persons in the provision's language had been interpreted broadly and consistently. They came back with 8 revised grounds. I replied to those too. They escalated to the Bureau's Kethmar Regional Director. I had 3 prior dealings with the Regional Director on supply classification disputes, and I knew her documentation style, her procedural preferences, and the 2 arguments she found persuasive that most people don't bother making. I made those arguments. Omen turned 5 during the appeals process. Seti Voss baked something that approximated a cake using settlement supply grain flour and dried fruit from our own stores, and we ate it at the kitchen table in the late afternoon with the windows open, and Omin got flour on my sleeve and looked at this with great satisfaction, the way she looks at things that go exactly as she expected. I gave her a second wooden figure better made than the first one. I'd been practicing in the evenings after the filings were done, and she held them both up and said something to Seti Voss in Velhari. Seti Voss said, "She says the new one looks like you." I looked at the figure. It was round and lumpy with a large flat base. "I can see that," I said. Omin laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, and it was the best sound I'd heard on Kethmar in 8 years. By the end of the 6th month, we had 3 things. We had a bureau ruling that the Settlement Expansion Provision application was procedurally valid and required substantive review. We had a Vethany Compliance Directorate acknowledgement extracted through a process that required me to cite the same regulation 11 times in 11 separate filings, but extracted nonetheless that Omin's status during the substantive review period was administratively pending rather than subject to remediation processing. And we had a recommendation from the CTS, Kethmar Regional Director, that the Bureau's Cross-Species Resettlement Standards Board consider the Velhari dispersal children's pending classification as a systemic issue, warranting expedited review. That last one was the one that mattered most, though it took me another 8 months to understand why. I'm going to skip forward, because the details of the next 2 years are administrative rather than human, and I have enough human things left to tell you. Omin came into direct sunlight for the first time, on a morning in Kethmar's second spring after her arrival. We'd been managing with UV panels and careful indoor light management, but the Kethmar Regional Director's recommendation had triggered a provisional residency certification that included outdoor access rights, which sounds, when I write it, like the most bureaucratic sentence I've ever composed. But what it meant in practice was that on a specific Tuesday morning, I opened the front door of the settlement residence, and Seti Voss brought Omin out onto the step, and we stood there in the morning. Kethmar's sun is not especially remarkable by stellar standards, but it is real, and it is warm, and it comes over the eastern ridge in the mornings, with a long golden light that catches the grain terraces and the dust motes, and fills the whole plateau with something that looks, if you're in the right mood, like grace. Omin stood on the front step in Seti Voss's arms and blinked at it. Her silver-green skin caught the light differently than ours. There's a slight bioluminescent undertone to Velhari's skin under direct starlight, a faint shimmer that isn't visible under artificial light, and in the morning sun she glowed, just faintly, like something that had been waiting a long time to be itself. She turned her face up to the light with her eyes closed. She was 5.5 by then. She'd been hidden in various crates and shelters since she was 19 months old. I don't have a word for what I felt watching her do that. I'm 53, and I've spent most of my life in administrative roles, and I tend to distrust my own emotions. As a category of data, they're real. I believe they're real, but they're unreliable narrators, and I've learned not to file them as facts until I've had time to verify them against what actually happened. What I can tell you is that I stood on that front step with Seti Voss beside me, close enough that our arms were touching, and we watched our daughter turn her face to the sun, and I understood something in my chest that I had not understood before about why any of what I'd spent the past 18 months doing had been worth doing. It wasn't a complicated understanding. It was just this. This was the reason. This specific morning, this specific child, this light on her face. The Settlement Expansion Provision application was granted in the 3rd year. Omin received Provisional Settlement Residency certification as a dependent of a compact registered settler family. The certification was limited and conditional, and subject to annual review, and attached to a long list of administrative requirements, all of which I know by heart, and all of which I fulfill with a completeness that I am told is unusual in the Bureau's experience of settler compliance. The Velhari dispersal children's pending classification was moved to expedited review by the Bureau's Cross-Species Resettlement Standards Board, 14 months after the Keth-Mar regional directors. Recommendation: the expedited review took 19 months. 31 Velhari children in various settlement placements across the Keth system received preliminary Federation registration in the board's initial determination. Omen was one of them. Preliminary registration is not full registration. That process is ongoing, and it moves at the speed that Federation processes move, which is a speed I have made my peace with. But preliminary registration means a file number, means a name in the system, means that when a compliance inspector runs biometrics, what comes back is a person. We did not receive any further compliance inspections until the 4th year. When they came, the lead inspector was not Kaveth Son. The new inspector was younger and read my filing number before she came in the door and treated the inspection as a routine administrative process, which is what it had become. She checked Omen's provisional residency certification, noted it was current, and moved on. Seti Vaz and I had a conversation in the 5th year that I want to tell you about, because it says something true. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. Omen was in the back room, which is still her room, though the crate has been gone for 4 years, replaced by a proper bed and a shelf of carved wooden figures, most of which I made, and some of which she made herself, using tools she'd found in the settlement's workshop. She has her mother's instinct for precision and her father's tendency to underestimate how much time something will take, and she produces objects that are structurally sound and aesthetically idiosyncratic, which I find deeply satisfying. We were sitting at the kitchen table and Seti Vaz said, out of no particular context, "I used to think the compact was a mistake." "The compact," I said, "the domestic partnership. When I filed the application, I didn't tell the Bureau about Omen, and I didn't tell you about Omen, and both of those things were strategic rather than honest. I went into it as a survival arrangement." "I know," I said. She looked at me. "You knew?" "Not the specifics," I said. "But the compact is a documented arrangement. Most people who apply for compact placement are applying because they need something. The Bureau designed it that way. I applied because I needed an administrator. You applied because you needed a placement where the inspection profile and the physical setup might give you room to manage an undocumented child." I paused. Neither of us was dishonest about that in any way that matters. She was quiet for a moment. "You could have reported the omission and ended the compact," she said. "In the first month, before the inspection, before any of the filings." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about that. "I watched you carry that crate in from the transport," I said. "You held it with both hands and you set it down like it contained something irreplaceable. I'm a cautious man, I told you that, but I'm not incurious. I understood before I knew that whatever was in that crate was the most important thing in your life, and that you were exhausted from protecting it. I thought I'd wait and see what you were protecting." Seti Vaz looked at me across the kitchen table. Her amber eyes were steady. "And then you met her," she said. "And then I met her," I said. Another quiet stretch. The wind was in the grain terraces. It always is. At this hour. "What we are," Seti Vaz said. "You and I. What this is." A small gesture at the kitchen. The house. The implied existence of our daughter in the room down the hall. "A family," I said. "I think that's the right word." She considered it. Then she said, "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I said. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Cool fingers, dry palm, the same as the first handshake in the transit depot, and completely different. We sat like that for a while. "I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm done." Kaveth Son showed up at the settlement in the 6th year. Not as a compliance inspector, he'd moved up, or been moved up, into a supervisory role in the regional office, and he came on an administrative site visit, rather than an inspection. He came with a younger inspector who was doing familiarization visits to settlements in the Keth-Mar region. I gave them the standard site tour. Grain storage, water reclamation, soil management. Seti Voss was in the office doing the seasonal filings. Omen was in the workshop, making something I could hear the tools from the path. At the end of the tour, Keveth Son said, "The juvenile's provisional residency was certified." "Omen," I said. "Yes. 3rd year. Annual review since then, all current." She received preliminary Federation registration. "Month 14 of the Standards Board expedited review," I said. He was quiet for a moment. We were standing at the edge of the settlement, looking out over the grain terraces in the afternoon light. The younger inspector had moved off to make notes about the soil management system. "The expansion provision application," Keveth Son said. "The filing you submitted." "Yes." That provision had not previously been applied to an unregistered Velhari child. "Your application was the first time it was tested in that context." "Yes," I said. He turned and looked at me with the expression of a man doing a professional assessment. "You knew it would be challenged." "I knew I had good arguments for the challenge," I said. "You could have lost." "Yes," I said. "And then I would have tried the next thing." He looked at me for another moment. I have been looked at by Vithani compliance officials for long enough that I can read the difference between the look that precedes a procedural action and the look that precedes a human moment, or what passes for a human moment, in a Vithani official, which is a different thing, but recognizable. This was the second kind. "I see," he said. "Is there anything else for the site visit?" I said. He said there wasn't, and they left. I watched the transport go over the ridge and stood there for a moment in the afternoon quiet, and then went back inside to the filing I'd been doing before they arrived. The form was half finished on my desk. I picked up the stylus and kept going. Omen is 8 years old now. She speaks Federation Standard better than I do. She has an ear for it that I don't, and she uses it with a precision that I recognize as her mother's, and a confidence that I like to think comes from somewhere else. She has 8 carved wooden figures on her shelf, and she can name every strain in our soil supplement rotation, and she has opinions about the grain terrace layout that are statistically better than mine, and that I have implemented over the past 2 seasons with measurable results. Last month, she came to the office while I was working on the annual compliance filing and sat in the chair by the window and watched me for a while. Then she said, "What are you doing?" "Filing," I said. "For me?" I looked at her. She was 8, and she knew, in the way children know things, that there were filings that had to do with her documents that were about her existence in a system that had not originally made room for it. "Yes," I said. She thought about that. "Will you always have to file?" "Until the full registration comes through," I said. "Yes. Probably a few more years." She nodded seriously. "Do you mind?" I put down the stylus and looked at my daughter, her amber eyes and her silver-green skin, and her hair going in all directions, lit up in the morning light, coming through the office window. "No," I said. "I don't mind." She nodded again, accepting this as a statement of fact, the way she accepts most things I say to her, not without scrutiny, but without needing me to perform the certainty. She reaches conclusions. Then she reached across and poked my knuckle once with one finger, the way she had the very first night, and hopped off the chair and went back to the workshop. I sat at the desk for a moment with my hand on the filing tablet, and the morning light came in through the window, and from down the hall, I could hear the sound of tools. Then I picked up the stylus and went back to work.